Well, good morning, church. I'm going to be trying something new. I'm going to be teaching out of the Bible this morning. Yay! So I wanted to start off this morning by telling you guys a little bit of a story. Back on August 31st, 1983, Korean Air Flight 007 was supposed to fly from New York to Anchorage and have a stop and then fly from Anchorage to Seoul, South Korea. Well, in the middle of the night, this flight left Anchorage to fly over the Pacific Ocean. And they had programmed all of their waypoints into a system called an INS system, which, if any of you in here are an older pilot or been flying for a long time, you know what that is. But instead of selecting INS, they selected a setting on the autopilot called heading, which what that means is instead of flying from coordinate to coordinate to coordinate, you select a direction and it just flies that one direction the whole time. So they set theirs at 245 degrees, or about southwest heading, and they just went. And on a long international flight, there's usually not a whole lot for pilots to do during cruise because the plane does all the flying and your job is to just watch it and check it and make sure everything is working. And in this case, the pilots were so comfortable they apparently weren't doing those checks. So instead of turning to follow their route, the plane stayed on 245, which was a little bit north of where they were supposed to be going. And so instead of turning, they kept going, and over again, they missed the warning signs. They didn't see their first reading that told them they were 12 miles off course. At each waypoint, they missed their checks to cross-reference with other beacons that are on small islands, during the process, so they didn't check that. They lost radio contact, and they didn't understand why, so they just relayed their messages through another flight. They never even noticed that their plane never actually made a turn. They just kept on flying. And at one point, they were talking to their sister flight, which they were only 10 minutes apart from each other on the same route. And they noticed that their wind conditions were completely different speeds and directions, which is odd because it shouldn't change that much in just 10 minutes. Well, when they heard this, their response, you could hear them on the flight data recorder, they said, well, this can happen. They were suffering from something called confirmation bias and belief perseverance, which means that you believe something so strongly that you never check to see if you're actually wrong. And they also just only accept the data that supports what they already think and dismiss everything that goes against it. Over and over again, they missed their chance to see how far off course they had been, which at this point was more than 300 miles. Now, this course was supposed to ride along a certain border because just north of that border, about 20 miles, was the line for Russian airspace. And they were now flying inside of that line by quite a bit. And it's also important to know what was happening in Russia at this time. This was 1983, so we were right in the middle of the Cold War. And that night, Russia was conducting missile tests on an island near this route. And the Russians had detected a large American spy plane over the ocean near where Korean Air Flight 007 was flying. And so as this passenger jet got close to Russian soil, the military thought that this was an American spy plane. And so right at the very moment when they were examining their winds and the pilot said, this can happen, he had no idea that two Russian fighters were moving into position right behind them. And because they thought this was a spy plane, the fighters tried to make contact using military methods. However, this was not a military plane, and it was dark, so none of their attempts to contact them actually worked. And so finally, when air traffic controller was able to get a hold of 007, it told them to climb to a higher altitude, and when they did, their airspeed slowed down, and so the fighter jet zoomed past them, and the fighter thought this was an evasive maneuver. And so with only a couple seconds left till they crossed back into international waters, the Russian commanders gave the fighters permission to fire on the plane. 2 missiles hit the tail of the plane, and it crashed into the ocean. And at this point, the Korean flight was more than 400 miles off course. And they never knew it. Well, if you're following along with your sermon notes this morning, today's message is called Drifting. We're in Mark chapter 14, looking at verses 3 through 9 as our core text, but we're also going to use John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, because it's the same story with a couple of different details. So we're kind of going to flop back and forth a little bit between those two. Now, before we hop into the message, I want to summarize our vision for you because we are kind of coming out of the vision series now. As I mentioned before, this is kind of the appendix to the series. But I want to make sure that we understand what we've been talking about here. So if we look at this slide, we'll see a picture of our vision in the pattern that you might recognize if you went through our first series, okay? And the idea here is that this is the personal angle of our vision, right? Connect, grow, serve, influence. You guys know this by now, right? I trust you know it. I'm not going to make you say it today, unless you really want to. But, which you just lost your chance. So connect, grow, serve, influence. That's what we're talking about, right? That's what we're supposed to do. And so basically, connect and influence are two things that are kind of at odds with each other. Where you're connecting is where you're in church community, and where you're influencing is it's where you work, live, and play, right? And so we have a responsibility to balance our time between those two things. Too much time in church, you end up living in a Christian bubble, you're no earthly good, right? But on the other side, if you're in the influence category too much, you're not spending time in Christian community, you're going to drift away, right? So we have to balance our time between those things. And these two, we balance our time between grow and serve, because God gives us things through what we call K4, right? Scripture, prayer, love, and worship, where God fills us up and he invests into us. This is where we study the word. This is where we're praying. This is where we're getting closer to God as he loves us, right? All these things come through that, but then that's supposed to translate into service. We're supposed to take what God fills us up with and overflow that into other people through service. Now, if you try to serve without that grow, then you're just dumping yourself out and you're going to burn out, right? But if you're always growing and never serving, well, you're just being a freeloader, okay? So it's important that we keep remembering this, right? That this is our personal vision. But one thing that we haven't talked about in this series is the next slide, which is our church view of this. Because connect, grow, serve, influence is also a process that our church has set up, right? We're supposed to move from connect to grow, from grow to serve, and from serve to influence. And our programs all line up with this at our church, right? So right now, you guys are participating in Connect. Congratulations, you're here this morning. That's awesome. Step 1, complete, all right? So this is where we gather together in church community as a whole, right? So either during Sunday services or special events or things like that, right? But then what we encourage you to do is then move on to the next step, to move, to not just say, well, I'm in church on Sunday, so I'm good. Right? Like there should be more of an investment in our relationship with God. And so grow is the next step. And the opportunities we have there is grow through life groups. Life groups are running right now if you want to be in one. It's a great place to connect with other people in our church and to even form relationships that could turn into disciple-making friendships where you're spending one-on-one, one-on-two time with people. I have both of these going on in my life right now. And then also we have off-season specials, and that's basically a name that I really liked for some reason, where when life groups aren't going, we spend time, we say, hey, we'll do special Bible studies or things that go apart from what we normally do. Marriage studies, we did a separate Bible study, we had ladies studies, so all these different things that go in addition to those. Those are opportunities for us to show up and grow, which then you should move to your serving opportunities, which we have all sorts. Sunday morning, there are some people who are literally serving right now. We have grow events, which is where you could be hosting a life group or something like that. Serving teams where you serve on a team, like doing youth ministry or something like that. We have individual opportunities, which you can do on your own schedule. Like if you're on the janitorial team, you can show up and clean on your own schedule, which is really nice. We have seasonal stuff, like our Christmas play or something we only do in the summer, something like that. And of course, you can make up your own opportunities to serve. You don't always have to do what people tell you to do. If you have a great idea of something you want to do it or talk to us, and we can get it figured out. And finally, the last step for our church programming is we push towards influence, which, of course, influence is what you do outside of these four walls, so we can't really, it's not like we're not going to program what you do outside of here, but we can equip you and encourage you to do it, right? And so this is our process that I think is important to remember. And one of the things that we have to know that we can often forget is those arrows there. Connect is supposed to go into serve, or into grow. Grow is supposed to go into serve. Serve into influence. And when you are outside these four walls influencing other people, the goal is to get them to come around and to connect so that they can start their process. And there's this multiplication thing going on where and this should be a process each of us is taking part in, okay? And I wanted to make sure that I went over that part during this series, even part of the appendix here, so that it's fresh in your minds as we move forward. It's really important that we understand as a church that this is the direction we're going. And as I keep on teaching this, it's important that we try to pursue what God is doing with this. But as with any practical teaching, right, we have to be careful. This vision was intentionally built to be flexible. Different for different people. We don't have a certain number of rules. You have to be in this many things. You have to do this many hours. If you don't serve 5 hours a week, then you're sinning or whatever. Right? It's not built like that. This way you can take this idea and use it to your advantage, but it's never going to work if you do one of two things with it. It's never going to work if you don't use it, and it's never going to work if you make it too rigid, or you might say if you make it too legalistic. If you want to understand this better, follow me over to Mark chapter 14, and we're going to take a look at some people who thought they were very confident in what they were doing and found out that they might actually be wrong. All right? So we're heading over to Mark chapter 14, and this story takes place just before Jesus heads to Jerusalem to be crucified. And so this actually sets us up not only to end our talks on our vision, but also to set us up for Palm Sunday and then Good Friday and Easter as well. So Mark chapter 14, verse 3 says this. And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. Okay, so Jesus is at the house of Simon the leper, and this woman does something very extravagant for Jesus, right? Now we're going to flip over to John because John gives us a little bit more detail here. John 12:2. It says this. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at table. Mary, therefore, took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of pure perfume. Okay, so some of these names might look familiar to you. Lazarus is in there. You may recognize him from being raised from the dead. Martha is here, serving yet again. Big shocker there. And Mary is here too, also again at the feet of Jesus. And she takes this really expensive stuff, right, and breaks the flask because, well, there's a reason she breaks it. If you're going to use something and only use a little bit, what do? You take the cap off, you put the cap back on, right? But if you're going to use all of it, you can break it. So she intends to use this whole thing, right? This is a big deal. This is likely stuff that would have been imported from India that would have cost about a year's salary for a poor, unskilled worker, okay? Now, this sacrifice that she makes brings about three major things. The first one that we see is that the house is filled with fragrance. It's filled with fragrance, which reminds me of something. Here's your first fill in the blank this morning if you got your Connect card, or you're filling in your blanks on your phone. The church has opportunities to worship together. Now, why do I say that? See, Mary is honoring Jesus in this moment, right? Worshiping him, preparing him for his burial, okay? But the whole house gets to smell it. So she's worshiping, but it affects other people. Do you realize that the way you worship affects other people? You know, we have a worship team up here on Sunday morning who is worshiping God, and their role is to take us with them, right? They're doing a task, and the rest of us should respond to that and worship with them, right? I mean, that makes sense. And so now Mary has done this, and everyone gets to smell the aroma of this very special perfume that she is sacrificing for Jesus. They could all be worshiping Jesus together at this moment, but not everyone does. Here's who doesn't. Let's go back to Mark 14, 4 and 5. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they scolded her. 300 denarii? That's like $3,000 she just wasted right there. And really, that's all a poor person would have had to live on back then, about $20 a day. Income inequality was very much exaggerated in ancient Rome, okay? And what the disciples see here when they see this act is not worship, but wastefulness. Why would you anoint Jesus with what is likely the most expensive thing you own when you could sell that and give it to the poor? Now, this seems like a very righteous stance, doesn't it? Right? Why waste it when you could do good with it, sister? And you might think, well, yeah, they're trying to do the right thing. They have more generous hearts. They're trying to be generous and caring for other people, which is interesting because you know there's a saying, you can't be generous with someone else's money. Ever heard that before? People always have opinions about what someone else should do with their stuff, right? And oftentimes it's because we'll benefit with what they do with their stuff if they change it to our way, right? Which brings up the second major thing that we see here in Mary's sacrifice, your next fill in the blank. We should not condemn the sacrifices of others. We should not condemn the sacrifices of others. Mary chose to honor Jesus with her expensive perfume by anointing him for burial. But of course, the others had their own opinion of what she should be doing. But here's the problem. It was not their sacrifice to make. This was Mary's possession. This was her sacrifice. And it's funny how people always think their ideas are the more important ones, naturally, right? If I have an idea, it's definitely more important because it's mine. It's like, oh, the church is spending money on painting the walls. Why not build a homeless shelter? What? I don't know if you could buy paint and build a homeless shelter for the same cost, but I didn't think that through. It's like, what? You're buying new speakers when you could, help to start up a foster care ministry or whatever, right? And we often give this type of criticism based on what we think. And we argue it as if we are morally superior. But as H.G. Wells once said, moral indignation is jealousy with a halo. So often we want to jump up on our high horse, right? It seems that we hold, leaders to higher standards than we would ever want to meet. Or we expect people to give more than we ever would. Or we make claims about what we would do in a position we've never been in. So many people would be so nice to the church if they won the lottery, but what are they doing now? Right? In truth, our criticism is that we try to decorate it with morality just to cover up our own jealousy. And maybe it's because you want the money that they have, or maybe because you want your cause to be done before theirs, or maybe you're just jealous that you didn't get to make the decision over what was more important. But the reality is that we let our opinions and our biases and our preferences rule over us sometimes. And if things don't go how we want them to, we look at the other person and say, well, you're wasteful, or you're selfish, or you're foolish, right? Which may be true, but what if it's not? In other words, you might look at a person and say, well, your preference is a sin, and my preference is righteous. And you might be thinking, well, wait a second. What if the disciples really were not jealous, but just trying to do the right thing? Well, let's flip back to John, and we'll see which disciples started this argument and why. Okay, verse 4. But Judas Iscariot, anybody ever heard of that guy before? He's got a good reputation, right? But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Okay, so Judas started this, and he wasn't trying to be righteous. He didn't care about the poor, right? He wanted the money to go into the bag so he could steal from it. That's what Judas wanted. And it's funny, you have to think about this. Do you think Judas got away with lying to Jesus in this case? Or do you think Jesus knew the whole time what Judas was doing? Just like he knew Judas was going to betray him ultimately, right? And yet what I find really interesting is Jesus knew what Judas was doing, and yet he never stopped him. He never stopped him. In fact, he loved him enough to let him keep serving alongside him. Now, if Jesus can do that, why do we then think that we should be the ones to condemn other people in church? Heck, we condemn people in church not because they're stealing. We condemn it for what we call not being good stewards, right? You shouldn't do that because I just don't think it's being a good steward. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe we should be good stewards. I'm not telling us, hey, everybody, don't be good stewards. Go spend money on dumb stuff. That's not what I'm saying. The question is, what is a good steward? Was Jesus a good steward of the money when he let Judas manage it? He knew it was going to be stolen. Of course Jesus was a good steward. You know why? Because Jesus was more concerned about loving people, even Judas, than he was about things like efficiency. In the U.S., we believe that efficiency is next to godliness. Right? How fast and cheap can we make our goods, right? How can we wring every last penny of profit out of an item? How can we cut costs to the 100th of a cent, even if it costs people? And don't get me wrong, money is important, but it's not more important than loving God by loving people. Jesus felt it was worth it to lose a few gold coins if it gave Judas a chance to repent. And here's what we learn. Your next fill in the blank. We should offer grace in others' inefficiencies. I offered an example a while ago about serving Jesus. You guys might remember this, but back in California, we had multiple food-based ministries going on for the homeless in our church. And we had a food pantry that was run by Debbie Young, and she squeezed every last piece of food she could through that pantry. Food's out of date? No problem. Vegetables went a little bad on one side, cut it off, send it out the other side, right? You got 650 pounds of Crisco? We'll give it away. Somebody needs Crisco, right? She wanted to be as efficient as possible to make sure she could help as many people as she could. Now, we had another ministry called Soul Food San Bernardino. Now, this was run by Bernie Braunwalder, and Bernie had a much different philosophy of how to do ministry. He went out, before he went to go serve the homeless in San Bernardino, he went out and bought them all steaks. He bought high-quality ingredients, and he had several options for people. He wanted the homeless people that he served to know that God valued them, that they were worth spending a few extra dollars on to make them feel special and loved by God. Now, let me ask you this, church. Who did their ministry the right way? Yes, they both did. They both did. It's not about the money, it's who they're spending the money for. If someone else takes their time or spends a little more or makes things a little fancier, that doesn't make it sin. Sin comes when you start worrying about judging those who are serving when you should be trying to serve yourself. If you don't believe me, let's go back to Jesus. Mark chapter 14, verse 6. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you will always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial." Now, I think this statement from Jesus tells us a lot. Jesus is saying, hey, you guys have gotten so comfortable even in serving people that you have forgotten that you're supposed to be serving me with it. They're like that Korean air flight. They've been on autopilot for so long, they don't see how far they've drifted off course. That they've forgotten that it's not just about being efficient with money. Let's take a look at the last three things that Jesus communicates to us in your fill in the blanks here this morning. Here's your next one. Getting in the way of another person's worship is a problem. The first thing Jesus says is, leave her alone. The disciples, who were led by Judas apparently, felt the need to change what she was doing. Now, was there something wrong with what she was doing? No. And so we can also learn this, your next fill in the blank after that. The church will always need to help with material needs. That responsibility is not going away. Okay? And everything I'm saying this morning is not permission to stop doing that. Right? Jesus didn't say the disciples were wrong for wanting to help the poor. He says they're wrong for trying to stop Mary from worshiping the way she was. Both of those things are important. We're supposed to be as wise as serpents and as gentle as doves. Right? So should we help the poor by being frugal and efficient? Yes. But should we also be willing to worship God with reverence and even extravagance? Yes. It's both. And we have to be careful that we don't do too much of either one because it can become an idol. Jesus says, look, the poor is always going to be here. And he said that almost 2,000 years ago, and so far, he's right. Haven't gone away yet. Right? There's no shortage of opportunity for us to help other people. And still, sometimes we focus on the temporal, we focus on that so much that it costs us the spiritual. Anybody ever heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Anybody ever heard of that before in here? About half of us? Essentially, it's a list of needs, and it's usually shown on a pyramid like this. This is basically the hierarchy of needs. And basically the theory is that you have your needs at the bottom, and if those aren't met, you don't care about the needs above it. Okay, that's basically how that works. So if your physiological needs aren't being met, you don't care about your safety, right? That's why somebody who's starving will go steal. Now, essentially, if you look at this, Abraham Maslow was not a Christian. So he did not put the gospel in that pyramid. And so the question is, where would you put the gospel on that pyramid? Most Christians would float it somewhere, maybe safety or social or something like that. Me, personally, I'd say the gospel isn't on that pyramid at all. I'm going to go more with Jesus' description on this one, okay? Matthew 7:24, Jesus says, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock." Our need for Jesus isn't on the pyramid because Jesus should be the foundation of that pyramid that our needs are built on. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? What does it profit a man to gain all your needs but not have Jesus? You might think all your needs are met, but if it isn't being met on the solid foundation of Christ, you really don't have anything going for you. And you might be thinking, but no, you don't need the gospel to survive like you need food and water. That stuff has to come first. And it's like interesting because Jesus talked about that. He said, man doesn't live by bread alone, which is at the bottom of that pyramid. He said, but every word that comes from the mouth of God. What about water? He said, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. Jesus says there is a need that is even more important than your basic temporal needs. And that's God. Now, it is true that Jesus was always concerned with the physical needs of people, but he was also always more concerned with their spiritual needs. Sometimes we get so caught up in the limited value that we have on this earth that we forget to worry about the parts of this life that apply to eternity. So yes, we do need to serve the poor, but, your last fill in the blank, we cannot forget to focus on eternal values. We cannot forget to focus on eternal values. Think about this. The disciples are saying what she's doing is wasteful, that this could provide food and shelter and clothing for a family for a whole year. And it's like, okay, wow, that is pretty valuable, isn't it? That matters a lot. But there's one more thing Jesus says here, Mark 14:9. He says, and truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Okay, so on one hand, you have the possibility that a family may have been provided for an entire year, and I'm sure they would be entirely grateful, but guess what? That year would then pass, and that's it. Would their clothing still be among us today? No. Would their house still be standing? Probably not. Would their food still be available? Not if they ate it. Yet this wasteful sacrifice for Jesus has this consequence of being remembered. For thousands of years since that moment happened, her actions have been read and studied by scholars. They've reminded people of how to worship Jesus well, and I would even venture to say that it likely encouraged people to remember to be generous. And who knows how many have built hospitals or schools or food pantries and the like because they were inspired by her generosity. Can you name one time for each disciple where they sold something and gave it to the poor? Can you do that? Probably not. But this lady's generosity made the cut to get into the scriptures. Think about that. This morning, all of us got to hear about what she did thousands of years later. So who made the better choice about what to do with that jar? You see, the value of what we do isn't determined just by how much money we spend, but by the things God is able to do with our gifts that we give back to him. It's like what Mother Teresa famously said, not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love. I don't know how you feel about Mother Teresa, but that quote right there is hard to debate with. Because things are only great when God makes them great. And so, church, let me connect this back to our vision. The plan that we have here is not just to give us a bunch of boxes that we need to check. It's not a list of rules you need to follow in a legalistic way. It's not some uniform plan that we all have to duplicate the exact same way so we all look exactly the same when we go out the doors. What it is a set of fostered opportunities and reminders for you. It's a way for you to look at your life and check on what you're doing. You might say it's a flight plan to help you make progress from one place to another without crossing into Russian territory. We don't need you to have Connect in church because you need to follow the rules. We need you to have Connect in church because we are a family, and families worship God together, and community is very important. We don't need you to grow because it's a rule, but because we need to grow because God tells us we need to grow. Right? And this goes for all of them. It gives us a chance to actually have something that matters, and these are just guidelines to help us get there. So the question for you this morning is, what is it that you need to focus on? What areas is God urging you to work on or to let go of? Are you spending too much time or so much time in the Word that you never pray? Are you spending so much time serving that you never rest? And what does God say about those things? You see, our vision is a set of guidelines to help make you a healthier Christian, because when you check and pursue these things, it makes you more available to God. So where do you need to be? What poor do you need to serve? What flasks of perfume do you need to break? And what criticisms do you need to keep to yourself? Only God can show you that. And I encourage you that you would seek him out in these things. That you would remember that God is the one working on you. And you would say, okay, God, my whole life needs to be going in your direction. It's about moving towards you. And the cost needs to be me. Whatever I need to let go of, Lord, help me to surrender and focus on living a balanced life for you.